Welcome to Mythology at Dusk. Take a slow breath. Whatever the day has held, however heavy it has been, let it settle now. Tonight, we visit ancient Greece and Rome. Tonight, we step into the quiet interior of a Roman house. Not the marble forums, not the great campaigns, but the ordinary evening life of the ordinary Roman family. We'll begin with the father, the paterfamilias, whose authority over his wife, his sons, and his household was by law absolute and could end only by his own hand. We'll listen for the meaning of a Roman name, the three names every citizen carried, marking him at once as a person, a family, and a branch of a house. And we'll follow a Roman marriage, the joining of two households by torchlight, the wife carried over the threshold, and the slow shaping of her life within it. Read gently tonight, from a book written more than 100 years ago, in the calm, plain English of a long-lost century. Before we begin, leave a comment and tell me where you are listening from tonight, and what time it is for you right now. Every comment helps this small channel reach someone else who needs quiet tonight. And if Mythology at Dusk has helped you sleep, consider subscribing so tomorrow night's story is ready when you are. Now close your eyes, take a slow breath, let the old stories carry you. Let us begin. The family. From Chapter 1, the family. Paragraph 17, the household. If by our word family we usually understand a group of husband, wife, and children, we may acknowledge at once that it does not correspond exactly to any of the meanings of the Latin familia, varied as the dictionaries show these to be. Husband, wife, and children did not necessarily constitute an independent family among the Romans, and were not necessarily members even of the same family. Those persons made up the Roman familia, in the sense nearest to its English derivative, who were subject to the authority of the same head of the house, paterfamilias. These persons might make a host in themselves: wife, unmarried daughters, sons real or adopted, married or unmarried, with their wives, sons, unmarried daughters, and even remoter descendants, always through males, yet they made but one familia in the eyes of the Romans. The head of such a family, household, or house is the nearest English word, was always sua juris, independent, one's own master, while the others were alieno jur, subject, dependent. Paragraph 18. The authority of the paterfamilias over his wife was called manus, over his descendants patria potestas, over his chattels dominica potestas. So long as he lived and retained his citizenship, these powers could be terminated only by his own deliberate act. He could dispose of his property by gift or sale as freely as we do now. He might emancipate his sons, a very formal proceeding, emancipatio, by which they became each the head of a new family, though they were childless themselves, or unmarried, or even mere children. He might also emancipate an unmarried daughter, who thus in her own self became an independent family. Or he might give her in marriage to another Roman citizen, an act by which she passed by early usage, Barbara 61, into the family of which her husband was head, if he was one sui juris, or of which he was a member, if he was still alieno jur subiectus. It must be carefully noticed, on the other hand, that the marriage of a son did not make him a paterfamilias, or relieve him in any degree from the patria potestas. He and his wife and their children were subject to the same head of the house as he had been before his marriage. On the other hand, the head of the house could not number in his familia his daughter's children. legitimate children always followed the father, while an illegitimate child was from the moment of birth in himself or herself an independent family. 19. The splitting up of a house. Emancipation was not very common, and it usually happened that the household was dissolved only by the death of the head. When this occurred, as many new households were formed as there were persons directly subject to his potestas at the moment of his death: wife, sons, unmarried daughters, widowed daughters-in-law, and children of a deceased son. The children of a surviving son, it must be noticed, merely passed from the potestas of their grandfather to that of their father. A son under age or an unmarried daughter was put under the care of a guardian, tutor, selected from the same genes, very often an older brother, if there was one. The following diagram will make this clearer. 1 Gaius, pater familias, plus 2 Gaia, mater familias. 3 Faustus, 4 Tullia, plus 5 Balbus, 6 Licinia, 7 Publius, 8 Terentia, 9 Marcus, 10 Terentia Minor, 11 Titus, 12 Tiberius, 13 Quintus, 14 Sextius, 15 Servius, 16 Decimus. Parable 20. It is assumed that Gaius is a widower who has had 5 children, 3 sons and 2 daughters. Of the sons, Faustus and Balbus married and had each 2 children. Balbus then died. Of the daughters, Terentia Minor married Marcus and became the mother of 2 children. Publius and Terentia were unmarried at the death of Gaius, who had emancipated none of his children. It will be noticed: 1. The living descendants of Gaius were 10, 3, 7, 8, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, his son Balbus being dead. 2. Subject to his potestas were 9, 3, 4, 6, 7, 8, 11, 12, 13, 14, 3. His daughter Terentia Minor, 10, had passed out of his potestas by her marriage with Marcus, 9, and her children, 15, 16, alone out of all the descendants of Gaius, had not been subject to him. 4. At his death are formed 6 independent families, one consisting of 4 persons, 3, 4, 11, 12, the others of 1 person each, 6, 7, 8, 13, 14, 5. Titus and Tiberius, 11, 12, have merely passed out of the potestas of their grandfather Gaius to come under that of their father Faustus. 21. Other meanings of familia. The word familia was also very commonly used in a slightly wider sense to include, in addition to the persons named above, verse 17, all the slaves and clients, and all the property real and personal belonging to the paterfamilias, or acquired and used by the persons under his potestas. The word was also used of the slaves alone, and rarely of the property alone. In a still wider and more important sense, the word was applied to a larger group of related persons, the genes, consisting of all the households, familiae, in the sense of paragraph 17, who derived their descent through males from a common ancestor. This remote ancestor, could his life have lasted through all the intervening centuries, would have been the paterfamilias of all the persons included in the genes, and all would have been subject to his potestas. Membership in the genes was proved by the possession of the nomen, the second of the 3 names that every citizen of the Republic regularly had, paragraph 38. Paragraph 22. Theoretically, this gens had been in prehistoric times one of the familia, households, whose union for political purposes had formed the state. Theoretically, its pater familias had been one of the heads of houses who in the days of the kings had formed the patres, or assembly of old men, senatus. The splitting up of this prehistoric household in the manner explained in paragraph 19, a process repeated generation after generation, was believed to account for the numerous infamiliae who claimed connection with the great gentes in later times. The gens had an organization of which little is known. It passed resolutions binding upon its members. It furnished guardians for minor children and curators for the insane and for spendthrifts. When a member died without leaving natural heirs, it succeeded to such property as he did not dispose of by will and administered it for the common good of all its members. These members were called gentals, were bound to take part in the religious services of the Malgens. Sacra gent lausia had a claim to the common property and might, if they chose, be laid to rest in the common burial ground. Finally, the word familia was often applied to certain branches of a gens whose members had the same cognomen, from Rar 48, the last of the three names mentioned in paragraph 21. For this use of familia, a more accurate word is stirps. Paragraph 23. Agnati. It has been remarked, paragraph 18, that the children of a daughter could not be included in the familia of her father, and 21. That membership in the larger organization called the gens was limited to those who could trace their descent through males. All persons who could in this way trace their descent through males to a common ancestor, in whose potestas they would be were he alive, were called agnat. And this agnatio was the closest tie of relationship known to the Romans. In the list of agnat were included two classes of persons who would seem by the definition to be excluded. These were the wife, who passed by manus into the family of her husband, paragraph 18, becoming by law his agnate, and the agnate of all his agnates, and the adopted son. On the other hand, a son who had been emancipated, paragraph 18, was excluded from agnatio with his father and his father's agnates, and could have no agnates of his own until he married or was adopted into another familia. The following diagram will make this clearer. 1 Gaius, pater familias. 2 Gaia, mater familias. 3 Faustus. 4 Tullia. 5 Balbus. 6 Licinia. 7 Publius. 8 Terentia. Emancipated. 9 Marcus. 10 Terentia Minor. 11 Titus. 12 Tiberius. 13 Quintus. 14 Sextius. Servius adopted by Gaius. 15 Servius. 16 Decimus. Emancipated. Paragraph 24. It is supposed that Gaius and Gaia have 5 children: Faustus, Balbus, Publius, Terentia, and Terentia Minor, and 6 grandsons: Titus and Tiberius, the sons of Faustus, Quintus and Sextius, the sons of Balbus, and Servius and Decimus, the sons of Terentia Minor. Gaius has emancipated 2 of his sons, Balbus and Publius, and has adopted his grandson, Servius, who had previously been emancipated by his father Marcus. There are 4 sets of our agnat. 1. Gaius, his wife, and those whose paterfamilias he is, viz. Faustus, Tullia the wife of Faustus, Terentia, Titus, Tiberius, and Servius, a son by adoption, 1, 2, 3, 4, 8, 11, 12, 15, 2. Balbus, his wife, and their 2 sons, 5, 6, 13, and 14. 3. Publius, who is himself a paterfamilias, but has no agnat at all. 4. Marcus, his wife Terentia Minor, and their child Decimus, 9, 10, 16. Notice that the other child, Servius, 15, having been emancipated by Marcus, is no longer agnate to his father, mother, or brother. Paragraph 25. Cognati, on the other hand, were what we call blood relations, no matter whether they traced their relationship through males or females, and regardless of what potestas had been over them. The only barrier in the eyes of the law was loss of citizenship, paragraph 18, and even this was not always regarded. Thus, in the table last given, Gaius, Faustus, Balbus, Publius, Terentia, Terentia Minor, Titus, Tiberius, Quintus, Sextius, Servius, and Decimus are all cognates with one another. So, too, is Gaia with all her descendants mentioned. So also are Tullia, Titus, and Tiberius, Licinia, Quintus, and Sextius, Marcus, Servius, and Decimus. But husband and wife, Gaius and Gaia, Faustus and Tullia, Balbus and Licinia, Marcus and Terentia Minor, were not cognates by virtue of their marriage, though that made them agnates. In fact, public opinion discountenanced the marriage of cognates within the 6th, later the 4th degree, and persons within this degree were said to have the ius osculare. The degree was calculated by counting from one of the interested parties through the common ancestor to the other, and may be easily understood from the table given in Smith's Dictionary of Antiquities under cognate, or the one given here, Fig. 1. Cognates did not form an organic body in the state, as did the agnates. 22. But the 22nd of February was set aside to commemorate the tie of blood, cara cognatio, and on this day presents were exchanged and family reunions probably held. It must be understood, however, that cognatio gave no legal rights or claims under the Republic. Illustration. Figure 1. Table of relationship. Para 26. Ad fines. Persons connected by marriage only were called ad fines, as a wife with her husband's cognates and he with hers. There were no formal degrees of ad finitas, as there were of cognatio. Those ad fines for whom distinctive names were in common use were Gina, son-in-law; Nurus, daughter-in-law; Sosa, father-in-law; Socras, mother-in-law; Prevignus, Previgna, stepson, stepdaughter; Ritricus, stepfather; Noverca, stepmother. If we compare these names with the awkward compounds that do duty for them in English, we shall have additional proof of the stress laid by the Romans on family ties. 2 women who married brothers were called Ian Traces, a relationship for which we do not have even a compound. The names of blood relations tell the same story. A glance at the table of cognates will show how strong the Latin is here, how weak the English. We have uncle, aunt, and cousin, but between avunculus and patruus, materterra and amita, patruelis and consoburnus, we can distinguish only by descriptive phrases. For atavus and tritavus, we have merely the indefinite forefathers. In the same way, the language testifies to the headship of the father. We speak of the mother country and mother tongue, but to the Roman, these were patria and sermo patrius. As the pater stood to the filius, so stood the patronus to the cliens, the patrici to the plebe, the patres, senators, to the rest of the citizens, and Jupiter, Jove the father, to the other gods of Olympus. Para 27. The family cult. It has been said, 23, that agnatio was the closest tie known to the Romans. The importance they attached to the agnatic family is largely explained by their ideas of the future life. They believed that the souls of men had an existence apart from the body, but not in a separate spirit land. They conceived of the soul as hovering around the place of burial and requiring for its peace and happiness that offerings of food and drink should be made to it regularly. Should these offerings be discontinued, the soul would cease to be happy itself and might become perhaps a spirit of evil. The maintenance of these rites and ceremonies devolved naturally upon the descendants from generation to generation, whom the spirits in turn would guide and guard. Illustration. Figure 2. Lucius Junius Brutus. Paragraph 28. The Roman was bound, therefore, to perform these acts of affection and piety so long as he lived himself, and bound no less to provide for their performance after his death by perpetuating his race and the family cult. A curse was believed to rest upon the childless man. Marriage was, therefore, a solemn religious duty, entered into only with the approval of the gods ascertained by the auspices. In taking a wife to himself, the Roman made her a partaker of his family mysteries, a service that brooked no divided allegiance. He therefore separated her entirely from her father's family, and was ready in turn to surrender his daughter without reserve to the husband with whom she was to minister at another altar. The pater familias was the priest of the household, and those subject to his potestas assisted in the prayers and offerings, the sacra familiaria. Para 29. But it might be that a marriage was fruitless, or that the head of the house saw his sons die before him. In this case, he had to face the prospect of the extinction of his family and his own descent to the grave with no posterity to make him blessed. One of two alternatives was open to him to avert such a calamity. He might give himself in adoption and pass into another family in which the perpetuation of the family cult seemed certain, or he might adopt a son and thus perpetuate his own. He usually followed the latter course because it secured peace for the souls of his ancestors no less than for his own. Paragraph 30. Adoption. The person adopted might be either a pater familias himself or, more usually, a filius familias. In the case of the latter, the process was called adoptio and was a somewhat complicated proceeding by which the natural parent conveyed his son to the other, the effect being to transfer the adopted person from one family to the other. The adoption of a paterfamilias was a much more serious matter, for it involved the extinction of one family, paragraph 29, in order to prevent the extinction of another. It was called aggregatio and was an affair of state. It had to be sanctioned by the pontifices, the highest officers of religion, who had probably to make sure that the aggregatus had brothers enough to attend to the interests of the ancestors whose cult he was renouncing. If the pontifices gave their consent, it had still to be sanctioned by the comitia curiata, as the aggregation might deprive the genes of its succession to the property of the childless man. Paragraph 22. If the comitia gave consent, the aggregatus sank from the position of head of a house to that of a filius familias in the household of his adoptive father. If he had wife and children, they passed with him into the new family, and so did all his property. Over him the adoptive father had potestas, as over a son of his own, and looked upon him as flesh of his flesh and bone of his bone. We can have at best only a feeble and inadequate notion of what adoption meant to the Romans. Paragraph 31. The patria potestas. The authority of the pater familias over his descendants was called usually the patria potestas, but also the patria maestas, the patrium ius, and the imperium paternum. It was carried to a greater length by the Romans than by any other people, a length that seems to us excessive and cruel. As they understood it, the pater familias had absolute power over his children and other agnatic descendants. He decided whether or not the newborn child should be reared. He punished what he regarded as misconduct with penalties as severe as banishment, slavery, and death. He alone could own and exchange property. All that his descendants earned or acquired in any way was his. According to the letter of the law, they were little better than his chattels. If his right to one of them was disputed, he vindicated it by the same form of action that he used to maintain his right to a house or a horse. If one was stolen, he proceeded against the abductor by the ordinary action for theft. If for any reason he wished to transfer one of them to a third person, it was done by the same form of conveyance that he employed to transfer inanimate things. The jurists boasted that these powers were enjoyed by Roman citizens only. 32. Limitations. But however stern this authority was theoretically, it was greatly modified in practice, under the Republic by custom, under the Empire by law. King Romulus was said to have ordained that all sons should be reared and also all firstborn daughters. Furthermore, that no child should be put to death until its 3rd year, unless it was grievously deformed. This at least secured life for the child, though the paterfamilias still decided whether it should be admitted to his household, with the implied social and religious privileges, or be disowned and become an outcast. King Numa was said to have forbidden the sale into slavery of a son who had married with the consent of his father. But of much greater importance was the check put upon arbitrary and cruel punishments by custom. Custom, not law, obliged the paterfamilias to call a council of relatives and friends, judicium domesticum, when he contemplated inflicting severe punishment upon his children, and public opinion obliged him to abide by their verdict. Even in the comparatively few cases where tradition tells us that the death penalty was actually inflicted, we usually find that the father acted in the capacity of a magistrate happening to be in office when the offence was committed, or that the penalties of the ordinary law were merely anticipated, perhaps to avoid the disgrace of a public trial and execution. 33. So, too, in regard to the ownership of property, the conditions were not really so hard as the strict letter of the law makes them appear to us. It was customary for the head of the house to assign to his children property, peculiar, cattle of their own, for them to manage for their own benefit. And more than this, although the paterfamilias held legal title to all their acquisitions, yet practically all property was acquired for and belonged to the household as a whole, and he was in effect little more than a trustee to hold and administer it for the common benefit. This is shown by the fact that there was no graver offence against public morals, no fouler blot on private character, than to prove untrue to this trust. Patrimonium profundere. Besides this, the long continuance of the potestas is in itself a proof that its rigour was more apparent than real. Illustration. Figure 3. Publius Cornelius Scipio Africanus. Buff 34. Extinction of the potestas. The patria potestas was extinguished in various ways. 1. By the death of the paterfamilias, as has been explained in paragraph 19. 2. By the emancipation of the son or daughter. 3. By the loss of citizenship by either father or son. 4. If the son became a flamendialis, or the daughter a virgo vestalis. 5. If either father or child was adopted by a third party. 6. If the daughter passed by formal marriage into the power, in manum, of a husband, though this did not essentially change her dependent condition. 35. 7. If the son became a public magistrate. In this case, the potestas was suspended during the period of office, but after it expired, the father might hold the son accountable for his acts, public and private, while holding the magistracy. 35. Manus. The subject of marriage will be considered later. At this point, it is only necessary to define the power over the wife possessed by the husband in its most extreme form, called by the Romans manus. By the oldest and most solemn form of marriage, the wife was separated entirely from her father's family, paragraph 28, and passed into her husband's power, or hand, conventio in manum. This assumes, of course, that he was sui juris. If he was not, then though nominally in his hand, she was really subject as he was to his pater familias. Any property she had of her own, and to have had any she must have been independent before her marriage, passed to him as a matter of course. If she had none, her pater familias furnished a dowry, dos, which shared the same fate. Whatever she acquired by her industry or otherwise while the marriage lasted also became her husband's. So far, therefore, as property rights were concerned, the manus differed in no respect from the patria potestas. The wife was in loco filiae, and on the husband's death, took a daughter's share in his estate. Pyra 36. Or, in other respects, manus conferred more limited powers. The husband was required by law, not merely obliged by custom, to refer alleged misconduct of his wife to the judicium domesticum, and this was composed in part of her cognates, paragraph 25. He could put her away for certain grave offences only. If he divorced her without good cause, he was punished with the loss of all his property. He could not sell her at all. In short, public opinion and custom operated even more strongly for her protection than for that of her children. It must be noticed, therefore, that the chief distinction between manus and patria potestas lay in the fact that the former was a legal relationship based upon the consent of the weaker party, while the latter was a natural relationship antecedent to all law and choice. Illustration, Figure 4, Lucius Cornelius Sulla, Bar 37, Dominica Potestas, the right of ownership in his property. Dominica Potestas was absolute in the case of a pater familias, and has been sufficiently explained in preceding paragraphs. This ownership included slaves as well as inanimate things, and slaves as well as inanimate things were mere chattels in the eyes of the law. The influence of custom and public opinion, so far as these tended to mitigating the horrors of their condition, will be discussed later. It will be sufficient to say here that there was nothing to which the slave could appeal from the judgment of his master. It was final and absolute. The name. From Chapter 2, the name. Paragraph 38, the triple name. Nothing is more familiar to the student of Latin than the fact that the Romans whose works he reads first have each a threefold name: Caius Julius Caesar, Marcus Tullius Cicero, Publius Virgilius Maro. This was the system that prevailed in the best days of the Republic, but it was itself a development, starting with a more simple form in earlier times and ending in utter confusion under the Empire. The earliest legends of Rome show us single names: Romulus, Remus, Faustulus. But side by side with these we find also double names: Numa Pompilius, Ancus Marcius, Tullus Hostilius. It is possible that single names were the earliest fashion, but when we pass from legends to real history, the oldest names that we find are double, the second being always in the genitive case, representing the father or the head of the house: Marcus Marci, Caecilia Metelli. A little later, these genitives were followed by the letter F for filius or filia or euxor to denote the relationship. Later still, but very anciently nevertheless, we find the freeborn man in possession of the three names with which we are familiar: the nomen to mark the clan, gens, the cognomen to mark the family, and the praenomen to mark the individual. The regular order of the three names is praenomen, nomen, cognomen, although in poetry the order is often changed to adapt the name to the meter. For a 39, great formality required even more than the three names. In official documents and in the state records, it was usual to insert between a man's nomen and cognomen the praenomina of his father, grandfather, and great-grandfather, and sometimes even the name of the tribe to which he belonged. So Cicero might write his name, M. Tullius M. F. M. N. M. Por. Cor. Cicero, that is, Marcus Tullius Cicero, son, Filius, of Marcus, grandson, Nepos, of Marcus, great-grandson, Pronopos, of Marcus, of the tribe Cornelia. See another example in Para 427. Illustration, Figure 5, Marcus Tullius Cicero, Para 40. On the other hand, even the triple name was too long for ordinary use. Children, slaves, and intimate friends addressed the citizen, master, and friend by his praenomen only. Ordinary acquaintances used the cognomen with the praenomen prefixed for emphatic address. In earnest appeals we find the nomen also used, with sometimes the praenomen or the possessive maimar prefixed. When two only of the three names are thus used in familiar intercourse, the order varies. If the praenomen is one of the two, it always stands first, except in the poets for metrical reasons, and in a few places in prose where the text is uncertain. If the praenomen is omitted, the arrangement varies. The older writers and Cicero put the cognomen first. Ahala Servilius, Kick, Milo, 3, 8, Kef, C, Servilius Ahala, Cat. Moroni 1, 3. Caesar puts the nomen first. Horace, Livy, and Tacitus have both arrangements, while Pliny adheres to Caesar's usage. It will be convenient to consider the three names separately and to discuss the names of men before considering those of the other members of the familia. Paragraph 41. The praenomen. The number of names used as praenomina seems to us preposterously small as compared with our Christian names, to which they in some measure correspond. It was never much in excess of 30, and in Sulla's time had dwindled to 18. The full list is given by the authorities named above, but the following are all that are often found in our school and college authors: Aulus, A, Decimus, D, Gaius, C, Gnaeus, CN, Caeso, K, Lucius, L, Manius, M, Marcus, M, Publius, P, Quintus, Q, Servius, Sir, Sextus, Sex, Spurius, SP, Tiberius, TI, and Titus, T. The forms of these names were not absolutely fixed, and we find for Gnaeus the forms Gnaevos, early, Naevos, Gnaeus, and Gnaeus, rare. So also for Servius, we find Sergius, the two forms going back to an ancient Sergius. The abbreviations also vary. For Aulus, we find regularly A. Diake, but also AV and AVL. For Sextus, we find Sext and Esmas as well as Sex, and similar variations are found in the case of other names. Paragraph 42. But small as this list seems to us, the natural conservatism of the Romans found in it a chance to display itself, and the great families repeated the names of their children from generation to generation in such a way as to make the identification of the individual very difficult in modern times. Thus the Aemili contented themselves with 7 of these praenomina: Gaius, Gnaeus, Lucius, Manius, Marcus, Quintus, and Tiberius, but used in addition one that is not found in any other genes: Mamercus, Mam. The Claudii used 6: Gaius, Decimus, Lucius, Publius, Tiberius, and Quintus, with the additional name Appius, APP, of Sabine origin, which they brought to Rome. The Cornelii used 7: Aulus, Gnaeus, Lucius, Marcus, Publius, Servius, and Tiberius. a still smaller number sufficed for the Julian genes, Gaius, Lucius, and Sextus, with the name Vopiscus, which went out of use in very early times. And even these selections were subject to further limitations. Thus, of the gens Claudia, only one branch, as stirps, known as the Claudii Nerones, used the names Decimus and Tiberius, and out of the 7 names used in the gens Cornelia, the branch of the Scipios, Cornelii Scipiones, used only Gnaeus, Lucius, and Publius. Even after a praenomen had found a place in a given family, it might be deliberately discarded. Thus, the Claudii gave up the name Lucius and the Manlii the name Marcus on account of the disgrace brought upon their families by men who bore these names, and the Antoni never used the name Marcus after the downfall of the famous triumvir Marcus Antonius. Illustration, Figure 6. Caesar. 43. From the list of names usual in his family, the father gave one to his son on the 9th day after his birth, the dies lustricus. It was a custom then, one that seems natural enough in our own times, for the father to give his own praenomen to his firstborn son. Cicero's name, Fabra 39, shows the name Marcus 4 times repeated, and it is probable that he came from a long line of eldest sons. When these names were first given, they must have been chosen with due regard to their etymological meanings and have had some relation to the circumstances attending the birth of the child. Livy, in speaking of the mythical Silvius Aeneas, gives us to understand that he received his first name because he was born in a forest. Silva, fra 44. So, Lucius meant originally born by day, Manius, born in the morning, Quintus, Sextus, Decimus, Posthumus, etc. indicated the succession in the family. Tullus was connected with the verb tollere in the sense of acknowledge, paragraph 95. Servius with servare, Gaius with gaudere. Others are associated with the name of some divinity, as Marcus and Mamercus with Mars, and Tiberius with the river god Tiberis. But these meanings in the course of time were forgotten as completely as we have forgotten the meanings of our Christian names, and even the numerals were employed with no reference to their proper force. Cicero's only brother was called Quintus. Illustration, Figure 7. Augustus. Paragraph 45. The abbreviation of the praenomen was not a matter of mere caprice, as is the writing of initials with us, but was an established custom, indicating perhaps Roman citizenship. The praenomen was written out in full only when it was used by itself or when it belonged to a person in one of the lower classes of society. When Roman names are carried over into English, they should always be written out in full and pronounced accordingly. In the same way, when we read a Latin author and find a name abbreviated, the full name should always be pronounced if we read aloud or translate. Paragraph 46. The nomen, this, the all-important name, is called for greater precision the nomen gentile and the nomen gentilicium. The child inherited it, as one inherits his surname now, and there was, therefore, no choice or selection about it. The nomen ended originally in Jais Ios, and this ending was sacredly preserved by the patrician families. The endings Ios, 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 and Haios Ios are merely variations from it. Other endings point to a non-Latin origin of the genes. Those in Aer Acus, Avidiacus, are Gallic. Those in Aer Enna, Caecna, are Etruscan. Those in Aer Enus or Aer Ianus, Salvidianus, are Umbrian or Piscine. Some others are formed from the name of the town from which the family sprang, either with the regular terminations Anus and Ensis Albanus, Norbanus, Aquiliensis, or with the suffix Andaius, Perusius, Parmensius, in imitation of the older and more aristocratic use. Standing entirely apart is the nomen of the notorious Gaius Verres, which looks like a cognomen out of place. Paragraph 55. Paragraph 47. The nomen belonged by custom to all connected with the gens, to the plebeian as well as the patrician branches, to men, women, clients, and freedmen without distinction. It was perhaps the natural desire to separate themselves from the more humble bearers of their nomen that led patrician families to use a limited number of praenomina, avoiding those used by their clansmen of inferior social standing. At any rate, it is noticeable that the plebeian families, as soon as political nobility and the busts in their halls gave them a standing above their fellows, showed the same exclusiveness in the selection of names for their children that the patricians had displayed before them. Paragraph 42. Illustration, Figure 8, Nero. Paragraph 48. The cognomen. Besides the individual name and the name that marked his gens, the Roman had often a third name, called the cognomen, that served to indicate the family or branch of the Sauch gens to which he belonged. Almost all the great Sargentes were thus divided, some of them into numerous branches. The Cornelian gens, for example, included the plebeian Dolabelli, Lentuli, Cethegi, and Cinnae, in addition to the patrician Scipiones, Maluginenses, Rufini, etc. The recognition of a group of clansmen as such a branch, or stirps, and as entitled to transmit a common Hans cognomen, required the formal consent of the whole Hans gens, and carried with it the loss of certain privileges as Hans gentles to the members of the Hans stirps. Paragraph 49. From the fact that in the official name, paragraph 39, the Hans cognomen followed the name of the tribe, it is generally believed that the oldest of these cognomina did not go back beyond the time of the division of the people into tribes. It is also generally believed that the not cognomen was originally a nickname, bestowed on account of some personal peculiarity or characteristic, sometimes as a compliment, sometimes in derision. So, we find many pointing at physical traits, such as Albus, Barbatus, Cincinnatus, Claudus, Longus, all originally adjectives, and the nouns Naso and Capito, the man with a nose, with a head. Others refer to the temperament, such as Benignus, Blandus, Cato, Serenus, Severus. Others still denote origin, such as Gallus, Ligus, Sabinus, Siculus, Tuscus. These names, it must be remembered, descended from father to son, and would naturally lose their appropriateness as they passed along, until in the course of time their meanings were entirely lost sight of, as were those of the praenomina. Paragraph 44. Paragraph 50. Under the Republic, the patricians had almost without exception this third or family name. We are told of but one man, Caius Marcius, who lacked the distinction. With the plebeians, the cognomen was not so common. Perhaps its possession was the exception. The great families of the Marii, Mummi, and Sertori had none, although the plebeian branches of the Cornelian gens, paragraph 48, the Tullian gens, and others did. The cognomen came, therefore, to be prized as an indication of ancient lineage, and individuals whose nobility was new were anxious to acquire it to transmit to their children. Hence, many assumed cognomina of their own selection. Some of these were conceded by public opinion as their due, as in the case of Cneius Pompeius, who took Magnus as his cognomen. Others were derided by their contemporaries, as we deride the made-to-order coat of arms of some 19th century upstart. It is probable, however, that only nobles ventured to assume cognomina under the Republic, though under the Empire, their possession was hardly more than the badge of freedom. Paragraph 51. Additional names. Besides the three names already described, we find not infrequently, even in Republican times, a fourth or fifth. These were also called cognomina, by a loose extension of the word, until in the 4th century of our era, the name agnomina was given them by the grammarians. They may be conveniently considered under 4 heads. In the first place, the process that divided the genes into branches might be continued even further. That is, as the genes became numerous enough to throw off a stirps, so the stirps, in process of time, might throw off a branch of itself, for which there is no better name than the vague familiar. This actually happened very frequently. The gens Cornelia, for example, threw off the stirps of the Scipiones, and these in turn the family or house of the Nasicae. So we find the quadruple name Publius Cornelius Scipio Nasica, in which the last name was probably given very much in the same way as the third had been given before the division took place. Paragraph 52. In the second place, when a man passed from one family to another by adoption, paragraph 30, he regularly took the 3 names of his adoptive father and added his own nomen gental with the suffix -anus. Thus, Lucius Aemilius Paulus, the son of Lucius Aemilius Paulus Macedonicus, see paragraph 53 for the last name, was adopted by Publius Cornelius Scipio and took as his new name Publius Cornelius Scipio Aemilianus. In the same way, when Caius Octavius Caepius was adopted by Caius Julius Caesar, he became Gaius Julius Caesar Octavianus, and is hence variously styled Octavius and Octavianus in the histories. 53. In the third place, an additional name, sometimes called cognomen ex virtute, was often given by acclamation to a great statesman or victorious general, and was put after his cognomen. A well-known example is the name of Publius Cornelius Scipio Africanus, the last name having been given him after his defeat of Hannibal. In the same way, his grandson by adoption, the Publius Cornelius Scipio Aemilianus mentioned above, received the same honorable name after he had destroyed Carthage, and was called Publius Cornelius Scipio Africanus Aemilianus. Such a name is Macedonicus, given to Lucius Aemilius Paulus for his defeat of Persens, and the title Augustus given by the Senate to Octavianus. It is not certainly known whether or not these names passed by inheritance to the descendants of those who originally earned them, but it is probable that the eldest son only was strictly entitled to take his father's title of honor. 54. In the fourth place, the fact that a man had inherited a nickname from his ancestors in the form of a cognomen, for 49, did not prevent his receiving another from some personal characteristic, especially as the inherited name had often no application, as we have seen, to its later possessor. To some ancient Publius, Cornelius was given the nickname Scipio, for 49, and in the course of time this was taken by all his descendants without thought of its appropriateness and became a cognomen. Then to one of these descendants was given another nickname for personal reasons, Nasica, and in course of time it lost its individuality and became the name of a whole family. 51. Then, in precisely the same way, a member of this family became prominent enough to need a separate name and was called Corculum, his full name being Publius Cornelius Scipio Nasica Corculum. It is evident that there is no reason why the expansion should not have continued indefinitely. Such names are Publius Cornelius Lentulus Spinther, Quintus Caecilius Metellus Sila, and Publius Cornelius Scipio Nasica Serapio. It is also evident that we cannot always distinguish between a mere nickname, one belonging strictly to this paragraph, and the additional cognomen that marked the family off from the rest of the stirps to which it belonged. It is perfectly possible that the name Spinther mentioned above has as good a right as Nassika to a place in the First Division, Borough 51. Borough 55. Confusion of names. A system so elaborate as that we have described was almost sure to be misunderstood or misapplied, and in the later days of the Republic and under the Empire, we find all law and order disregarded. The giving of the praenomen to the child seems to have been delayed too long sometimes, and burial inscriptions are numerous which have in place of a first name the word pupus, PVP, child, showing that the little one had died unnamed. One such inscription gives the age of the unnamed child as 16 years. Then confusion was caused by the misuse of the praenomen. Sometimes two are found in one name, e.g. Publius alias Alienus Archelaus Marcus. Sometimes words ending like the nomen in au ius were used as praenomina. Cicero tells us that one, Numerius Quintius Rufus, owed his escape from death in a riot to his ambiguous first name. The familiar Gaius must have been a nomen in very ancient times. Like irregularities occur in the use of the nomen, two in a name were not uncommon, one being derived from the family of the mother perhaps. Occasionally 3 or 4 are used, and 14 are found in the name of one of the consuls of the year 169 AD. Then by a change, the converse of that mentioned above, a word might go out of use as a praenomen and become a nomen. Cicero's enemy, Lucius Sergius Catilina, had for his Gentile name Sergius, which had once been a first name, for Borough 41. The cognomen was similarly abused. War, it ceased to denote the family and came to distinguish members of the same family, as the praenomina originally had done. Thus, the 3 sons of Marcus Annaeus Seneca, for example, were called Marcus Annaeus Novatus, Lucius Annaeus Seneca, and Lucius Annaeus Mela. So, too, a word used as a cognomen in one name might be used as a fourth element in another. For example, in the names Lucius Cornelius Sulla and Lucius Cornelius Lentulus Sura. The third and fourth elements, respectively, are really the same, being merely shortened forms of Surula. Finally, it may be remarked that the same name might be arranged differently at different times. In the consular lists, we find the same man called Lucius Lucretius Tricipit Nus Flavus and Lucius Lucretius Flavus Tricipit Inus. Borough 56. There is even greater variation in the names of persons who had passed from one family into another by adoption. Some took the additional name, paragraph 52, from the Haun Stirps, instead of from the Haun Gens, that is, from the Haun Cognomen, instead of from the Haun Nomen. A son of Marcus Claudius Marcellus was adopted by a certain Publius Cornelius Lentulus, and ought to have been called Publius Cornelius Lentulus Claudianus. He took instead the name Publius Cornelius Lentulus Marcellinus, and this name descended to his children. The confusion in this direction is well illustrated by the name of the famous Marcus Junius Brutus. A few years before Caesar fell by his hand, Brutus, as we usually call him, was adopted by his mother's brother, Quintus Servilius Caepio, and ought to have been called Quintus Servilius Caepio Unianus. For some reason unknown to us, he retained his own cognomen, and even his close friend Cicero seems scarcely to know what to call him. Sometimes he writes of him as Quintus Caepio Brutus, sometimes as Marcus Brutus, sometimes simply as Brutus. The great scholar of the 1st century, Asconius, calls him Marcus Caepio. Finally, it may be noticed that late in the empire, we find a man struggling under the load of 40 names. 57. Names of women. No very satisfactory account of the names of women can be given, because it is impossible to discover any system in the choice and arrangement of those that have come down to us. It may be said in general that the threefold name was unknown in the best days of the Republic, and that praenomina were rare and when used were not abbreviated. We find such praenomina as Paula and Vibia, the masculine forms of which early disappeared, Gaia, Lucia, and Publia, and it is probable that the daughter took these from her father. More common were the adjectives Maxuma and Minor, and the numerals Secunda and Tertia, but these, unlike the corresponding names of men, seem always to have denoted the place of the bearer among a group of sisters. It was more usual for the unmarried woman to be called by her father's nomen in its feminine form, Tullia, Cornelia, with the addition of her father's cognomen in the genitive case, Cassilia Metel, followed later by the letter wife, Philia, to mark the relationship. Sometimes she used her mother's nomen after her father's. 1. The married woman, if she passed into her husband's hand, manus, paragraph 35, by the ancient patrician ceremony, originally took his nomen, just as an adopted son took the name of the family into which he passed, but it cannot be shown that the rule was universally or even usually observed. Under the later forms of marriage, she retained her maiden name. In the time of the empire, we find the threefold name for women in general use, with the same riotous confusion in selection and arrangement as prevailed in the case of the names of men at the same time. Paragraph 58. Names of slaves. Slaves had no more right to names of their own than they had to other property, but took such as their masters were pleased to give them, and even these did not descend to their children. In the simpler life of early times, the slave was called pua, just as the word boy was once used in this country for slaves of any age. Until late in the Republic, the slave was known only by this name corrupted to por and affixed to the genitive of his master's first name, Marcipor, Marcus, Pua, Marcus's slave. When slaves became numerous, this simple form no longer sufficed to distinguish them, and they received individual names. These were usually foreign names, often denoting the nationality of the slave, sometimes, in mockery perhaps, the high-sounding appellations of Eastern potentates, such names as Afa, Eleutheros, Pharnaces. By this time, too, the word servus had supplanted pua. We find, therefore, that toward the end of the Republic, the full name of a slave consisted of his individual name, followed by the nomen and praenomen, the order is important, of his master, and the word servus, Pharnaces, Egnati, Publi, servus. When a slave passed from one master to another, he took the ornomen of the new master and added to it the cognomen of the old with the suffix or anus. When Anna, the slave of Maecenas, became the property of Livia, she was called Anna Liviae Serva Maecenatiana. Illustration, Figure 9, Trajan. Paragraph 59. Names of freedmen. The freedman regularly kept the individual name which he had had as a slave, and was given the nomen of his master with any praenomen the latter assigned him. Thus, Andronicus, the slave of Marcus Livius Salinator, became, when freed, Lucius Livius Andronicus, the individual name coming last as a sort of cognomen. It happened naturally that the master's praenomen was often given, especially to a favorite slave. the freedman of a woman took the name of her father, e.g. Marcus Livius Augusti L. Ismarus. The letter L stands for L. Libertus and was inserted in all formal documents. Of course, the master might disregard the regular form and give the freedman any name he pleased. Thus, when Cicero manumitted his slaves, Tyro and Dionysius, he called the former in strict accord with custom, Marcus Tullius, Tiro. But to the latter, he gave his own praenomen and the nomen of his friend Titus Pomponius Atticus, the new name being Marcus Pomponius Dionysius. The individual names, Pharnaces, Dionysius, etc., were dropped by the descendants of freedmen, who were anxious with good reason to hide all traces of their mean descent. Paragraph 60. Naturalized citizens. When a foreigner was given the right of citizenship, he took a new name, which was arranged on much the same principles as have been explained in the cases of freedmen. His original name was retained as a sort of cognomen, and before it were written, the praenomen that suited his fancy and the nomen of the person, always a Roman citizen, to whom he owed his citizenship. The most familiar example is that of the Greek poet Archias, whom Cicero defended under the name of Aulus Licinius Archias in the well-known oration. He had long been attached to the family of the Luculi, and when he was made a citizen took as his nomen that of his distinguished patron Lucius Licinius Lucullus. We do not know why he selected the first name Aulus. Another example is that of the Gaul mentioned by Caesar, B.G. I. 47, Gaius Valerius Cabarus. He took his name from Caius Valerius Flaccus, the governor of Gaul at the time that he was given his citizenship. It is to this custom of taking the names of governors and generals that is due the frequent occurrence of the name Julius in Gaul, Pompeius in Spain, and Cornelius in Sicily. Marriage and the position of women. From Chapter 3, Marriage and the Position of Women. Paragraph 61. Early forms of marriage. Polygamy was never practiced at Rome, and we are told that for 5 centuries after the founding of the city, divorce was entirely unknown. Up to the time of the Servian constitution, date uncertain, the patricians were the only citizens and intermarried only with patricians and with members of surrounding communities having like social standing. The only form of marriage known to them was the stately religious ceremonial called, as will be explained hereafter, confariatio, with the direct consent of the gods, with the pontifices celebrating the solemn rites, in the presence of the accredited representatives of his current genes. The patrician took his wife from her father's family into his own, 28, to be a mater familias, to rear him children who should conserve the family mysteries, perpetuate his ancient race, and extend the power of Rome. By this, the one legal marriage of the time, the wife passed in manum vir, and the husband acquired over her practically the same rights as he had over his own children, 35, 36, and other dependent members of his family. Such a marriage was said to be cum conventione uxoris in manum vir. 35. Paragraph 62. During this period, too, the free non-citizens, paragraph 177, 178, the plebeians, had been busy in marrying and giving in marriage. There is little doubt that their unions had been as sacred in their eyes, their family ties as strictly regarded and as pure as those of the patricians, but these unions were unhallowed by the national gods and unrecognized by the civil law, simply because the plebeians were not yet citizens. Their form of marriage was called usus, and consisted essentially in the living together of the man and woman as husband and wife for a year, though there were, of course, conventional forms and observances, about which we know absolutely nothing. The plebeian husband might acquire the same rights over the person and property of his wife as the patrician, but the form of marriage did not in itself involve manus. The wife might remain a member of her father's family and retain such property as he allowed her, paragraph 33, by merely absenting herself from her husband for the space of a trinoctium each year. If she did this, the marriage was sine conventione in manum, and the husband had no control over her property. If she did not, the marriage, like that of the patricians, was cum conventione in manum. Illustration, figure 10, Hadrian. Paragraph 63. At least as far back as the time of Servius goes another Roman form of marriage, also plebeian, though not so ancient as usus. It was called coemptio and was a fictitious sale by which the pater familias of the woman, or her guardian, tutor, if she was sui juris, transferred her to the man matrimoni causa. This form must have been a survival of the old custom of purchase and sale of wives, but we do not know when it was introduced among the Romans. It carried manus with it as a matter of course, and seems to have been regarded socially as better form than usus. The two existed for centuries side by side, but coemptio survived usus as a form of marriage, cum conventione in manum. Paragraph 64. Uorum ius connubi. While the Servian constitution made the plebeian citizens and thereby legalized their forms of marriage, it did not give them the right of intermarriage with the patricians. Many of the plebeian families were hardly less ancient than the patricians. Many were rich and powerful, but it was not until 445 BC that marriages between the two orders were formally sanctioned by the civil law. The objection on the part of the patricians was largely a religious one. The gods of the state were patrician gods. The auspices could be taken by patricians only. The marriages of patricians only were sanctioned by heaven. Their orators protested that the unions of the plebeians were no better than promiscuous intercourse. They were not iustae nuptiae. Paragraph 67. The plebeian wife was taken in matrimonium. She was at best an uxor, not a mater familias. Her offspring were mother's children, not patricio. 65. Much of this was class exaggeration, but it is true that at this early date the gens was not so highly valued by the plebeians as by the patricians, and that the plebeians assigned to cognates certain duties and privileges that devolved upon the patrician or gentles. With the ius connubi, many of these points of difference disappeared. New conditions were fixed for diustae nuptiae. Coemptio, by a sort of compromise, became the usual form of marriage when one of the parties was a plebeian, and the stigma disappeared from the word matrimonium. On the other hand, patrician women learned to understand the advantages of a marriage sine conventione. A marriage with manus gradually became less frequent. The taking of the auspices before the ceremony came to be considered a mere form. A marriage began to lose its sacramental character, and with these changes came later the laxness in the marital relation and the freedom of divorce that seemed in the time of Augustus to threaten the very life of the Commonwealth. For 66, it is probable that by the time of Cicero marriage with manus was uncommon, and consequently that confariatio and coemptio had gone out of general use. To a limited extent, however, the former was retained until Christian times, because certain priestly offices, flamines maiores and reges sacrorum, could be filled only by persons whose parents had been married by the confariate ceremony, the one sacramental form, and who had themselves been married by the same form. But so great became the reluctance of women to submit to manus, that in order to fill even these few priestly offices, it was found necessary under Tiberius to eliminate manus from the confariate ceremony. Var 67. Nuptiae iustae. There were certain conditions that had to be satisfied before a legal marriage could be contracted even by citizens. It was required: 1. That the consent of both parties should be given, or of the pater familias, if one or both were in potestate. Under Augustus, it was provided that the pater familias should not withhold his consent unless he could show valid reasons for doing so. 2. That both parties should be puberes. There could be no marriage between children. Although no precise age was fixed by law, it is probable that 14 and 12 were the lowest limit for the man and woman respectively. 3. That both man and woman should be unmarried. Polygamy was never practiced at Rome. 68. 4. That the parties should not be nearly related. The restrictions in this direction were fixed rather by public opinion than by law and varied greatly at different times, becoming gradually less severe. In general, it may be said that marriage was absolutely forbidden between ascendants and descendants, between other cognates within the 4th degree, paragraph 25, and the nearer adfines, paragraph 26. If the parties could satisfy these conditions, they might be legally married, but distinctions were still made that affected the civil status of the children, although no doubt was cast upon their legitimacy or upon the moral character of their parents. 69. If the husband and wife were both Roman citizens, their marriage was called iustae nuptiae, which we may translate regular marriage. Their children were iust laber, and were by birth cives optimo jure, possessed of all civil rights. If but one of the parties was a Roman citizen and the other a member of a community having the ius connubii, but not the full civitas, the marriage was still called iustae nuptia, but the children took the civil standing of the father. This means that if the father was a citizen and the mother a foreigner, the children were citizens. But if the father was a foreigner and the mother a citizen, the children were foreigners, peregrine, with the father. But if either of the parties was without the ius connubii, the marriage, though still legal, was called nuptia iniustae, or matrimonium iniustum, an irregular marriage, and the children, though legitimate, took the civil position of the parent of lower degree. We seem to have something analogous to this in the loss of social standing, which usually follows the marriage of a person with one of distinctly inferior position. 70. Betrothals, betrothal, sponsalia. As a preliminary to marriage was considered good form, but was not legally necessary, and carried with it no obligations that could be enforced by law. In the sponsalia, the maiden was promised to the man as his bride with words of style, that is, in solemn form. The promise was made, not by the maiden herself, but by her pater familias, or by her tutor, if she was not in potestate. In the same way, the promise was made to the man directly only in case he was sui juris, otherwise to the head of his house, who had asked for him the maiden in marriage. The words of style were probably something like this: Sponden Gaiam, tuam filiam, or if she was a ward, Gaiam, Luci filiam, mihi, or filio meo, uxorem da, de benevortant, spondeo. De benevortant. 71. At any rate, the word spondeo was technically used of the promise, and the maiden was henceforth une sponsor. The person who made the promise had always the right to cancel it. This was usually done through an intermediary, nuntius, and hence the formal expression for breaking an engagement was repudium renuntiare, or simply renuntiare. While the contract was entirely one-sided, it should be noticed that a man was liable to infamia if he formed 2 engagements at the same time, and that he could not recover any presents made with a view to a future marriage if he himself broke the engagement. Such presents were almost always made, and while we find that articles for personal use, the toilet, etc., were common, a ring was usually given. The ring was worn on the 3rd finger of the left hand because it was believed that a nerve ran directly from this finger to the heart. It was also usual for the sponsor to make a present to her betrothed. Paragraph 72. The dowry. It was a point of honor with the Romans, as it is now with some European nations, for the bride to bring to her husband a dowry, pas dos. In the case of a girl in potestate, this would naturally be furnished by the head of her house. In the case of one sua juris, it was furnished from her own property, or if she had none, was contributed by her relatives. It seems that if they were reluctant, she might by process of law compel her ascendants at least to furnish it. In early times, when marriage, cum conventione, prevailed, all the property brought by the bride became the property of her husband or of his paterfamilias, paragraph 35. But in later times, when manus was less common, and especially after divorce had become of frequent occurrence, a distinction was made. A part of the bride's possessions was reserved for her own exclusive use, and a part was made over to the groom under the technical name of dos. The relative proportions varied, of course, with circumstances. 73. Essential forms. There were really no legal forms necessary for the solemnization of a marriage. There was no license to be procured from the civil authorities. The ceremonies, simple or elaborate, did not have to be performed by persons authorized by the state. The one thing necessary was the consent of both parties, if they were sua juris, or of their patres familias, if they were in potestate. It has been already remarked, 67, 1, that the paterfamilias could refuse his consent for valid reasons only. On the other hand, he could command the consent of persons subject to him. It is probable that parental and filial affection, pietas, made this hardship less rigorous than it now seems to us. Paragraph 32, 33. Illustration, figure 11, Antoninus Pius. 74. But while this consent was the only condition for a legal marriage, it had to be shown by some act of personal union between the parties. That is, the marriage could not be entered into by letter or by the intervention of a third party. Such an overt act was the joining of hands, dextrarum junctio, in the presence of witnesses, or the escorting of the bride to her husband's house, never omitted when the parties had any social standing, or in later times the signing of the marriage contract. It was never necessary to a valid marriage that the parties should live together as man and wife, though, as we have seen, paragraph 62, this living together of itself constituted a legal marriage. Paragraph 75. The wedding day. It will be noticed that superstition played an important part in the arrangements for a wedding 2,000 years ago, as it does now. Especial pains had to be taken to secure a lucky day. The calends, nones, and ides of each month, and the day following each of them, were unlucky. So was all of May and the first half of June, on account of certain religious ceremonies observed in these months, the Argean offerings and the Lemuria in May, and the Dies Religios, connected with Vesta in June. Besides these, the Dies Parentales, February 1321, and the days when the entrance to the lower world was supposed to be open, August 24th, October 5th, and November 8th, were carefully avoided. 1/3 of the year, therefore, was absolutely barred. The great holidays, too, and these were legion, were avoided, not because they were unlucky, but because on these days friends and relatives were sure to have other engagements. Women marrying for the second time chose these very holidays to make their weddings less conspicuous. 76. The wedding garments. On the eve of her wedding day, the bride dedicated to the lares of her father's house her bulla, Forum 99, and the toga praetexta, which married women did not wear, and also, if she was not much over 12 years of age, her childish playthings. For the sake of the omen she put on before going to sleep, the tunica recta, or regilla, woven in one piece and falling to the feet. A very doubtful picture is shown in Rich under the word recta. It seems to have derived its name from having been woven in the old-fashioned way at an upright loom. This same tunic was worn at the wedding. Illustration, Figure 12, dressing the bride. 77. On the morning of the wedding day, the bride was dressed for the ceremony by her mother, and Roman poets show unusual tenderness as they describe her solicitude. There is a wall painting of such a scene, found at Pompeii and reproduced in Fig. 12. The chief article of dress was the tunica regilla already mentioned, which was fastened around the waist with a band of wool tied in the knot of Hercules, Nodus Herculaneus, probably because Hercules was the guardian of wedded life. This knot the husband only was privileged to untie. Over the tunic was worn the bridal veil, the flame-coloured veil, flammeum, shown in Fig. 13. So important was the veil of the bride that nubere, to veil oneself, is the regular word for marry when used of a woman. Illustration, Figure 13, the flammeum. For 78. Especial attention was given to the arrangement of the hair, but unfortunately, we have no picture preserved to us to make its arrangement clear. We only know that it was divided into 6 locks by the point of a spear, probably a reminiscence of the ancient marriage by capture, and that these locks, perhaps braided, were kept in position by ribbons. Vitae. The bride had also a wreath of flowers and sacred plants gathered by herself. The groom wore, of course, the toga and had a similar wreath of flowers on his head. He was accompanied to the home of the bride at the proper time by relatives, friends, and clients, who were bound to do him every honor on his wedding day. 79. The ceremony. The house of the bride's father, where the ceremony was performed, was decked with flowers, boughs of trees, bands of wool, and tapestries. The guests arrived before the hour of sunrise, and even then, the omens had been already taken. In the ancient confarreate ceremony, these were taken by the public augur, but in later times, no matter what the ceremony, the haruspices merely consulted the entrails of a sheep which had been killed in sacrifice. When the marriage ceremonies are described, it must be remembered that only the consent was necessary, for 73, with the act expressing the consent, and that all other forms and ceremonies were unessential and variable. Something depended upon the particular form used, but more upon the wealth and social position of the families interested. It is probable that most weddings were a good deal simpler than those described by our chief authorities. Praefati. After the omens had been pronounced favourable, the bride and groom appeared in the atrium, the chief room, and the wedding began. This consisted of 2 parts. 1. The ceremony proper, varying according to the form used, confarreatio, coemptio, or usus, the essential part being the consent before witnesses. 2. The festivities, including the feast at the bride's home, the taking of the bride with a show of force from her mother's arms, the escort to her new home, the essential part, and her reception there. Illustration, Figure 14, a marriage scene. 81. The confarreate ceremony began with the dextrarum iunctio. The bride and groom were brought together by the pronuba, a matron married to her first husband, and joined hands in the presence of 10 witnesses representing the 10 gentes of the curia. These are shown on an ancient sarcophagus found at Naples, Figascia 14. Then followed the words of consent spoken by the bride. Quando tu Gaius, ego Gaia. The formula was unchanged, no matter what the names of the bride and groom, and goes back to a time when Gaius was a nomen, not a praenomen, Paragraph 55. It implied that the bride was actually entering the gens of the groom, Paragraph 23, 28, 35, and was probably chosen for its lucky meaning, Paragraph 44. Even in marriages, sine convenzione, the old formula came to be used, its import having been lost in lapse of time. The bride and groom then took their places side by side at the left of the altar and facing it, sitting on stools covered with the pelt of the sheep slain for the sacrifice. Illustration, Figure 15, a camillus. 82. A bloodless offering was then made to Jupiter by the Pontifex Maximus and the Flamen Dialis, consisting of the cake of spelt, farum labum, from which the confarreatio got its name. With the offering to Jupiter, a prayer was recited by the flamen to Juno as the goddess of marriage, and to Tellus, Picumnus, and Pilumnus, deities of the country and its fruits. The utensils necessary for the offering were carried in a covered basket, cumarus, by a boy called Camillus, Fig. Nas. 15, whose parents must have both been living at the time, patrimus et matrimus. Then followed the congratulations, the guests using the word felicita. 83. The coemptio began with the fictitious sale, carried out in the presence of no less than 5 witnesses. The purchase money represented by a single coin was laid in the scales held by a libripens. The scales, scale holder, coin, and witnesses were all necessary for this kind of marriage. Then followed the dextrarum iunctio and the words of consent, borrowed, as has been said, from the confarreate ceremony. Originally, the groom had asked the bride, "And sibi mater familias esse velle?" She assented, and put to him a similar question, "And sibi pater familias esse velle?" To this, he too gave the answer, "Yes." A prayer was then recited and sometimes perhaps a sacrifice offered, after which came the congratulations as in the other and more elaborate ceremony. Friar 84. The third form, that is, the ceremonies preliminary to hash usus, probably admitted of more variation than either of the others, but no description has come down to us. We may be sure that the hands were clasped, the words of consent spoken, and congratulations offered, but we know of no special customs or usages. It was almost necessary for the 3 forms to get more or less alike in the course of time, though the cake of spelt could not be borrowed from the confarreate ceremony by either of the others, or the scales and their holder from the ceremony of coemptio. 85. The wedding feast. After the conclusion of the ceremony came the wedding feast, cena nuptialis, lasting until evening. There can be no doubt that this was regularly given at the house of the bride's father, and that the few cases when we know that it was given at the groom's house were exceptional and due to special circumstances, which might cause a similar change today. The feast seems to have concluded with the distribution among the guests of pieces of the wedding cake, mustaceum, which was made of meal steeped in must, paragraph 296, and served on bay leaves. There came to be so much extravagance at these feasts, and at the Repotia, mentioned below, paragraph 89, that under Augustus it was proposed to limit their cost by law to 1,000 sesterces, $50. A piece of sumptuary legislation as vain as such restrictions have usually proved to be. Prayer 86. The bridal procession. After the wedding feast, the bride was formally taken to her husband's house. This ceremony was called deductio, and as it was essential to the validity of the marriage, prayer 74, it was never omitted. It was a public function, that is, anyone might join the procession and take part in the merriment that distinguished it, and we are told that persons of rank did not scruple to wait in the street to see the bride. As evening approached, the procession was formed before the house with torchbearers and flute players at its head. When all was ready, the marriage hymn, Hymenaeus, was sung, and the groom took the bride with a show of force from the arms of her mother. The Romans saw in this custom a reminiscence of the rape of the Sabines, but it probably goes far back beyond the founding of Rome to the custom of marriage by capture that prevailed among many peoples. The bride then took her place in the procession attended by 3 boys, patrum et matrum. 82. 2 of these walked by her side, holding each a hand, while the other carried before her the wedding torch of white thorn, spina alba. Behind the bride were carried the distaff and spindle, emblems of domestic life. The Camillus, with his cumerus, also walked in the procession. Prayer 87. During the march were sung the verses Fescenen, abounding in coarse jests and personalities. The crowd also shouted the ancient marriage cry, the significance of which the Romans themselves did not understand. We find it in at least 5 forms, all variations of the name Thalassius or Thalassio, who was probably a Sabine divinity, though his functions are unknown. Livy derives it from the supposed name of a senator in the time of Romulus. The bride dropped on the way one of 3 coins, which she carried as an offering to the lares compitales. Of the other 2, she gave one to the groom as an emblem of the dowry she brought him, and one to the lares of his house. The groom meanwhile scattered nuts through the crowd. This is explained by Catullus as a token of his having become a man and having put away childish things, Prayer 103, but the nuts were rather a symbol of fruitfulness. The custom survives in the throwing of rice in modern times. Paragraph 88. When the procession reached the house, the bride wound the doorposts with bands of wool, probably a symbol of her own work as mistress of the household, and anointed the door with oil and fat, emblems of plenty. She was then lifted carefully over the threshold, in order to avoid the chance of so bad an omen as a slip of the foot on entering the house for the first time. Others, however, see in the custom another survival of marriage by capture. She then pronounced again the words of consent, ubi tu Gaius, ego Gaia, and the doors were closed against the general crowd. Only the invited guests entered with the pair. Illustration, Figure 16, the marriage couch. For F89, the husband met the wife in the atrium and offered her fire and water in token of the life they were to live together and her part in the home. Upon the hearth was ready the wood for a fire, and this the bride kindled with the marriage torch which had been carried before her. The torch was afterwards thrown among the guests to be scrambled for as a lucky possession. A prayer was then recited by the bride, and she was placed by the pronuba on the lectus genialis, Fig. 16, which always stood on the wedding night in the atrium. Here it afterwards remained as a piece of ornamental furniture only. On the next day was given in the new home the second wedding feast, Repotia, to the friends and relatives, and at this feast the bride made her first offering to the gods as a matrona. A series of feasts followed, given in honor of the newly wedded pair by those in whose social circles they moved. T. The position of women. With her marriage, the Roman woman reached a position unattained by the women of any other nation in the ancient world. No other people held its women in so high respect. Nowhere else did they exert so strong and beneficent an influence. In her own house, the Roman matron was absolute mistress. She directed its economy and supervised the tasks of the household slaves, but did no menial work herself. She was her children's nurse and conducted their early training and education. Her daughters were fitted under their mother's eye to be mistresses of similar homes and remained her closest companions until she herself had dressed them for the bridal and their husbands had torn them from her arms. She was her husband's helpmeet in business as well as in household affairs, and he often consulted her on affairs of state. She was not confined at home to a set of so-called women's apartments, as were her sisters in Greece. The whole house was hers. She received her husband's guests and sat at table with them. Even when subject to the manners of her husband, the restraint was so tempered by law and custom, paragraph 36, that she could hardly have been chafed by the fetters which had been forged with her own consent, paragraph 73, paragraph 91. Out of the house the matron's dress, stola matronalis, paragraph 259, secured for her the most profound respect. Men made way for her in the street. She had a place at the public games, at the theatres, and at the great religious ceremonies of state. She could give testimony in the courts, and until late in the Republic might even appear as an advocate. Her birthday was sacredly observed and made a joyous occasion by the members of her household, and the people as a whole celebrated the Matronalia, the great festival on the 1st of March, and gave presents to their wives and mothers. Finally, if she came of a noble family, she might be honoured, after she had passed away, with a public eulogy, delivered from the rostra in the forum. Paragraph 92. It must be admitted that the education of women was not carried far at Rome, and that their accomplishments were few, and rather useful and homely than elegant. But the Roman women spoke the purest and best Latin known in the highest and most cultivated circles, and so far as accomplishments were concerned, their husbands fared no better. Respectable women in Greece were allowed no education at all. Paragraph 93. It must be admitted, too, that a great change took place in the last years of the Republic. With the laxness of the family life, the freedom of divorce, and the inflow of wealth and extravagance, the purity and dignity of the Roman matron declined, as had before declined the manhood and the strength of her father and her husband. It must be remembered, however, that ancient writers did not dwell upon certain subjects that are favourites with our own. The simple joys of childhood and domestic life, home, the praises of sister, wife, and mother may not have been too sacred for the poet and the essayist of Rome, but the essayist and the poet did not make them their themes. The mother of Horace must have been a singularly gifted woman, but she is never mentioned by her son. The descriptions of domestic life, therefore, that have come down to us are either from Greek sources or are selected from precisely those circles where fashion, profligacy, and impurity made easy the work of the satirist. It is, therefore, safe to say that the pictures painted for us in the verse of Catullus and Juvenal, for example, are not true of Roman women as a class in the times of which they write. The strong, pure woman of the early day must have had many to imitate her virtues in the darkest times of the empire. There were mothers then, as well as in the times of the Gracchi. There were wives as noble as the wife of Marcus Brutus. And so we come to the end of tonight's reading. Sleep well. Dream of old worlds. Until tomorrow night.